This week's Mind Espresso is all about how to manage your emotions rather than have your emotions manage you. And I'm going to look again at the work by Dr. Susan David, who wrote Emotional Agility. Also, it's something called the Plutchick Wheel, and then we're going to delve into the purpose of emotions, because there's a biological purpose for emotions. A lot of people are under the impression that their emotions are them, and that's not true, right? An emotion is a signal, as Dr. Susan David says, and it's up to us to interpret and adjust and see if that signal's right and if the emotion is serving the right purpose. Really interesting when you break it out, because there's a biological purpose for each emotion, broadly, right? And broadly, we'll get into it right now. For instance, sadness has a signal and a biological purpose. The signal is loss, right? And the biological purpose is to slow us down, to allow us to process. But if we're getting triggered all the time, right, into sadness, and we're always in process mode, we have to ask the question, is this useful to me? Or is there a better emotion? And then if it's not the right emotion, then we have to figure out why we're getting triggered and how we can adjust our emotion. So let's go through some of these. Sadness means loss. That's the communication that it's having with your brain. And the purpose is to slow down so that we can process. Fear, the signal is you're in danger. The biological purpose is to prepare you to get away from danger. Anger, very closely related to fear. It's really kind of the flip side of the fight or flight system, right? It prepares you to fight. And the signal is that something has been taken from you and you need to fight for it. And the biological purpose is really to dumb down the brain, right? The energy flows away from the thinking part of the brain, which is why people who are angry all the time make bad decisions all the time, and they stuck in these loops, like people get stuck in sadness loops and anger loops and fear loops. Love reminds us that this is something we want in our life, and the biological purpose is to make more connections with that person we feel love for. Joy says we want this in our life too, and it reminds us to find more things like that. Now, when you think of emotions as signals with a biological purpose, then it allows us to start saying, is this useful? For instance, I used to get triggered on anger when I would drive. I would get road rage. It's rather embarrassing, but it happened a lot. And it happened to the point where it was affecting my day, because my daily commute always involved someone doing something, like cutting me off, because I used to get on something called the Alaskan Skyway or Highway in Seattle, and someone was always cutting me off. And I would get so angry. And so my biological purpose is to get ready to fight, but it serves no purpose because I'm not fighting anyone in the car, right? So here's a perfect example of where I'm getting triggered and the biological purpose doesn't serve what I need. Now I'm going to bring in rules and triggers. Underneath my anger was a rule. And that rule was something that, had carried with me from when I was young, that if someone does something to me, I need to get angry if they violate my space. And by the way, we think of the car as an extension of ourselves, which is why we get so angry in the car. So I had to look at that and say, is this a useful rule? And is my biological purpose aligned with the purpose I need, which is to get to work and be in a good mood when I get to work? And it wasn't. But it turned out it was very simple. Once I understood what the rule was and what was triggering me, which is anytime someone got really close to me and cut me off, then I would get angry. Once I knew that, I reset the rule and it made the trigger more lax, right? I just said to myself, my new rule is I will not get angry if someone cuts me off. I'll feel bad for them. Now, that doesn't work for everyone. That happened to work for me. And I said my trigger is going to be I'm only getting angry if someone actually hits my car, right? So I moved my anger trigger. Guess what? 3 days later, entire problem went away. And it's something that had been with me for a while. Now I'll give you a flip side. I had a weird rule around joy. I wasn't allowing myself to experience joy unless I was at the very top of whatever it was I was doing. I know, a bit silly, right? You can't be the top of everything in life. But I had this rule that was left over from my childhood, which came from my father-son relationship, that I had to either be the best or I was nothing, right? Or be at the top or I was nothing. And so I actually had a problem where I was having a hard time experiencing joy. So here's a flip side. In this case, I made the trigger tighter and I changed the rule. Instead of I have to be best in the circumstance, I have to find something worthwhile in the circumstance. And I have to be grateful for what I have. So if I show gratefulness and find something worthwhile, there I would find joy. And suddenly joy became easier, right? And so again, the take home here is, what is your emotional frame? And are you experiencing sadness, anger, fear, anxiety, shame too much? If so, then you have an underlying rule that's a problem, and it's probably left over from your childhood. Then you have triggers that are setting you off, and you have to just look at those triggers. And then you have to just simply write them down and reset them and make it harder to experience those, and then make it easier to experience things like love and joy. And a lot of people have problems with love because they don't love themselves, therefore they don't feel like they deserve love, therefore it makes it very hard for them to get love. And again, here's an underlying rule where you need to change the rule and you need to change the trigger to make it easier. So in sum, emotions are just signals, they're not you, and you have to, using your brain, right, and not just being controlled by your emotions, think about, is it really appropriate? And what is appropriate? What would make my life easier? And the way to do that is to look at the rule underneath the emotion. What's the trigger? What triggers that emotion? Then what's the signal, right? What is it signaling me? And what's the ultimate purpose? And does that purpose work for me? And again, the helpful resources here are Susan David's Emotional Agility, the Plutchick Wheel, and just look up Purpose of Emotions. And that's this week's Mind Espresso.